The desert wind carried more than dust that morning, it carried secrets that would shatter everything Samuel Rodriguez thought he knew about courage, loyalty, and the thin line between civilization and wilderness. What started as a routine cattle drive would become a test of conscience that would echo through the canyons of New Mexico territory for generations to come. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one pointing a rifle at your chest, but the one who forces you to look into your own soul and question everything you've ever believed about right and wrong. Samuel Rodriguez adjusted his worn hat against the blazing New Mexico sun as he guided his horse through the narrow canyon pass. The year was 1883, and the territory still held secrets in every shadow and danger behind every rock formation. His cattle ranch, the Double R, sprawled across 3,000 acres of harsh but beautiful desert landscape, and today he was tracking down 6 head of cattle that had wandered off during the night storm. The morning air was crisp despite the promise of another scorching day ahead. Samuel had been ranching this land for 12 years, ever since he'd mustered out of the cavalry with a bullet scar on his shoulder and dreams of building something lasting in this unforgiving country. He'd seen his share of Apache raids, cavalry charges, and the endless cycle of violence that seemed to define life on the frontier. But, lately, things had been quiet. Too quiet, some folks said, like the calm before a storm. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Thunder, picked his way carefully over the loose rocks scattered across the canyon floor. Samuel's practiced eyes scanned the ground for cattle tracks while his ears stayed tuned to any sound that didn't belong in the desert morning symphony. Birds called from hidden perches, somewhere a lizard skittered across stone, and the wind whispered through the sagebrush that clung to life in the rocky soil. That's when he saw her. At first, Samuel thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The figure appeared like a mirage shimmering in the heat, but, as Thunder stepped closer, the image became heartbreakingly real. A young Apache woman stood in the center of a small clearing, her traditional dress torn and stained with what looked like dried blood. The fabric, once beautiful with intricate beadwork, now hung in tatters around her slight frame. Her long black hair was tangled with burrs and thorns, and her dark eyes held a wild, desperate look that made Samuel's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, but her face carried the weight of someone who had seen too much suffering. When she spotted Samuel, she didn't run. Instead, she stood perfectly still, like a deer caught in an open meadow, her breathing shallow and quick. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and Samuel could see the tension in every line of her body. Samuel slowly dismounted, his movements careful and deliberate. He'd learned long ago that sudden gestures could mean the difference between peaceful contact and bloodshed. The woman's eyes tracked his every movement, and he could see the calculation behind her gaze. She was measuring distances, escape routes, probably wondering if she could outrun his horse if she needed to flee. "Easy there," Samuel said softly, the way he might speak to a spooked horse. "I'm not going to hurt you." The woman tilted her head slightly, and Samuel realized she might not understand English. He tried a few words in Spanish, then attempted some basic Apache phrases he'd picked up during his cavalry days. Recognition flickered in her eyes at the Apache words, even though his pronunciation was probably terrible. As he studied her more closely, Samuel's heart sank. The tears in her dress weren't just from thorns and rocks. The pattern of damage suggested violence, and the dark stains on the fabric told a story he didn't want to imagine. Her wrists showed rope burns, and there were bruises on her arms in the distinct pattern of finger grips. The woman suddenly spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. The Apache words tumbled out in a rush, desperate and pleading. Samuel caught fragments that he thought meant help and men and something that might have been soldiers, but her dialect was different from what he'd learned, and fear made her speech rapid and unclear. Samuel raised his hands slowly, palms outward, in the universal gesture of peace. "I want to help you," he said, mixing English and the few Apache phrases he knew. "You're safe now." The woman's legs seemed to give out suddenly, and she sank to her knees in the red dirt. The adrenaline that had been keeping her upright finally abandoned her, and Samuel could see exhaustion take over her features. She hadn't just been running recently, she'd been running for days, maybe longer. Without thinking, Samuel stepped forward and knelt beside her. This close, he could see that she was even younger than he'd first thought, probably no more than 18. Her face was streaked with dust and tears, and her lips were cracked from dehydration. When he offered her his water canteen, she looked at it suspiciously for a moment before desperation won out. She drank deeply, water spilling down her chin as she gulped it down. While she drank, Samuel scanned the surrounding canyon walls and listened for any sounds that might indicate pursuit. The fact that she was alone and in this condition suggested that whoever had harmed her might still be looking for her. His mind raced through possibilities: rogue soldiers, outlaws, other Apache from a rival band, but none of them were good. The woman finished drinking and looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and lingering terror. She spoke again, more slowly this time, and Samuel caught more words. She pointed back toward the eastern ridge and said something that sounded urgent. Then, she grabbed his arm, her small fingers digging into his sleeve with desperate strength. Samuel followed her gaze toward the ridge and felt ice form in his stomach despite the growing heat. Dust clouds were rising in the distance, kicked up by multiple horses moving fast. The woman saw them too and tried to stand, panic flashing across her face. Her legs wouldn't support her, and she fell back down with a small cry of frustration. "How many?" Samuel asked, pointing toward the dust clouds and holding up fingers. The woman held up both hands, then added 3 more fingers. 13 riders. That was too many to fight, even if Samuel had been armed for war instead of cattle herding. He wore his old cavalry colt on his hip and had his Winchester in the saddle boot, but 13 determined men could overwhelm him easily in this terrain. The dust clouds were getting closer, and Samuel had to make a decision. Everything he'd been taught during his cavalry service said that Apache women were often just as dangerous as the warriors, that showing mercy to an enemy was a luxury that could get you killed. But, looking at this broken, terrified girl, all he could see was someone who needed help. Samuel made his choice. He scooped the woman up in his arms, surprised by how light she was. She tensed at first, then seemed to understand what he was doing and wrapped her arms around his neck. Her body was trembling, whether from fear, exhaustion, or both, he couldn't tell. "We're getting out of here," Samuel muttered as he lifted her onto Thunder's saddle. The horse snorted and shifted but remained steady as Samuel swung up behind her. The woman fit against his chest like she belonged there, and Samuel tried not to think about how natural it felt to hold her. He spurred Thunder toward the narrow passage that led deeper into the canyon system. If they could reach the maze of rocks and hidden passages that honeycombed this part of the territory, they might be able to lose their pursuers. Samuel knew this land better than most, having spent years learning every waterhole, every cave, every game trail that crossed his property. Behind them, the dust clouds were definitely getting closer. Samuel could make out individual riders now, and his blood chilled when he recognized the mix of blue cavalry uniforms and civilian clothes. This wasn't a war party of Apache warriors hunting for a missing woman. This was something much worse: a mixed group of soldiers and civilians, probably the kind of men who operated outside the law and beyond the reach of military justice. The woman said something in Apache that sounded like a warning, and Samuel urged Thunder faster through the winding passage. The canyon walls rose higher on both sides, creating blessed shade but also limiting their escape routes. If their pursuers caught them in here, they'd be trapped with nowhere to run. Samuel's mind was already working on their next move. He knew of a hidden cave about 2 miles ahead, concealed behind a waterfall that flowed even during the dry season. If they could reach it before their pursuers spotted them, they might be able to wait out the search. But, first, they had to survive the next few minutes. Thunder's hooves rang against stone as they raced through the canyon, and Samuel hoped the sound wouldn't carry too far in the desert air. The woman in his arms had stopped trembling and now sat perfectly still, her head turning constantly as she watched for danger. Whatever had happened to her, it had sharpened her survival instincts to a razor's edge. As they rode, Samuel found himself wondering who she was, where she'd come from, and what exactly had brought her to this desperate state. But those questions would have to wait. Right now, his only priority was keeping both of them alive long enough to find some answers. The sound of shod hooves on rock echoed from behind them, growing louder with each passing moment. Their pursuers had entered the canyon and were gaining ground. Samuel leaned lower over Thunder's neck and whispered Apache words he hoped meant hold on to the woman in his arms. The chase was just beginning, and Samuel Rodriguez was about to discover that some rescues come with a price that changes everything. Thunder's muscles bunched and stretched beneath them as Samuel guided the horse through increasingly narrow passages between towering red rock walls. The sound of pursuit grew fainter as they twisted deeper into the labyrinth of canyons that Samuel had explored during countless hunting trips over the years. The woman in his arms remained silent, but he could feel the tension in her body as she listened for their enemies. The hidden cave Samuel remembered lay behind a thin curtain of water that cascaded down a sheer cliff face. Finding it required following a game trail that was barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Samuel had discovered it 3 years ago while tracking a wounded deer, and he'd never told another soul about its existence. Today, that secret might save their lives. When they finally reached the waterfall, Samuel felt a surge of relief. The narrow opening behind the falling water was still there, partially concealed by hanging vines and moss that thrived in the constant mist. He dismounted carefully and helped the woman down, her legs still unsteady beneath her. Thunder snorted and shook his mane, sensing safety in this hidden place. Samuel led them through the waterfall, the cold spray a shocking relief after the desert heat. The cave beyond was larger than it appeared from outside, with a sandy floor and walls that curved back into mysterious darkness. Filtered sunlight through the water created dancing patterns on the stone walls, and the air was cool and humid compared to the dry furnace outside. The woman immediately moved to the cave entrance and listened intently, her head cocked like a hunting animal. After several minutes, she seemed to relax slightly and turned to study Samuel with curious eyes. For the first time since he found her, she didn't look ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Samuel unsaddled Thunder and hobbled him near the small pool where the waterfall collected before flowing out through cracks in the rock floor. The horse would be comfortable here, with fresh water and shade, and the sound of the falling water would mask any noise he might make. When Samuel turned back to his unexpected companion, he found her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Up close, in the soft light filtering through the water, he could see details that had been hidden by distance and urgency. Her face was fine-boned and intelligent, with high cheekbones and a strong jawline that spoke of determination even in her current state of exhaustion. The beadwork on her torn dress was intricate and beautiful, suggesting she came from a family of some standing within her tribe. Samuel offered her more water and some jerky from his saddlebags. She accepted both gratefully, eating with the careful efficiency of someone who had been truly hungry. While she ate, Samuel studied the entrance to their refuge and tried to plan their next moves. The woman finished eating and spoke softly in Apache, gesturing toward herself. Samuel caught what sounded like a name, Ayana, and she repeated it while pointing to her chest. He nodded and pointed to himself. Samuel, he said clearly. Sam. She tried the name, her pronunciation careful and exact. Samuel. It was the first time he'd heard her voice without fear in it, and the sound sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. Her voice was melodic, with the musical quality that characterized many Apache speakers, and even his foreign name sounded beautiful in her accent. Ayana, if that was indeed her name, stood and moved to the cave wall where ancient pictographs decorated the stone surface. Her fingers traced the faded images of hunters and animals, and she spoke in Apache while pointing to different figures. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but her tone suggested she was telling him something important about this place. She turned back to him and spoke more urgently, using gestures to supplement her words. Samuel caught fragments: soldiers, bad men, something about fire, and words that might have referred to her family or village. Her eyes filled with tears as she spoke, and Samuel's heart ached for whatever tragedy had brought her to this point. Samuel wished desperately that his Apache was better, but he'd learned only basic military phrases during his cavalry service. Most soldiers hadn't bothered to learn the language of the people they fought, viewing it as unnecessary and possibly dangerous. Now Samuel regretted that short-sightedness. He tried to communicate his own situation using simple words and gestures. He pointed outside and made writing motions, then held up fingers to indicate the cattle he'd been tracking. Ayana nodded understanding, and Samuel was struck by how quick and intelligent she was despite the trauma she'd endured. As the afternoon wore on, they developed a basic system of communication using gestures, simple words in both languages, and drawings scratched in the sandy cave floor. Samuel learned that Ayana's band had been attacked 3 days ago, that many people had died, and that she had been captured by men who wore both soldier uniforms and civilian clothes. The details of her escape were harder to understand, but Samuel gathered that she had managed to get away during the night while her captors slept. She had been running ever since, hiding during the day and moving at night, until exhaustion and dehydration had finally stopped her in the clearing where Samuel found her. When Ayana tried to describe her captors, her whole body tensed with remembered fear. She drew images in the sand of men with guns, and, when she drew one particular figure, a man with sergeant's stripes and a distinctive hat, her hand shook so badly she had to stop. Samuel felt anger building in his chest as he began to understand what had happened. Rogue soldiers operating without orders, probably selling Apache prisoners as slaves or worse. It wasn't uncommon on the frontier, where military justice was often miles away and good men sometimes turned bad under the pressure of constant warfare. As evening approached, Samuel knew they needed to make some decisions. Staying in the cave was safe for now, but they couldn't remain here indefinitely. Ayana needed proper food, medical attention for her injuries, and safety from her pursuers. But where could he take an Apache woman in 1883 New Mexico territory where she would be truly safe? The territorial government had a complicated relationship with the Apache people. Some bands were confined to reservations under military guard, others were still fighting an increasingly hopeless war against encroaching settlers and miners. An Apache woman traveling with a white rancher would attract attention wherever they went, and not all of that attention would be friendly. Ayana seemed to understand his dilemma without words. She spoke quietly in Apache, her tone resigned and sad. Samuel caught words that might have meant go and alone, and he realized she was telling him to leave her here and save himself. The idea revolted him. Samuel had seen too much death and suffering in his cavalry years to abandon someone who needed help, especially someone as brave as this young woman who had survived horrors he could barely imagine. But keeping her with him would put them both at risk, and he had no idea how to navigate the complex tribal politics that might be involved in returning her to her people. Outside their waterfall shelter, the desert night was falling with the sudden completeness common to arid lands. Stars appeared like scattered diamonds against the black sky, and the temperature began its nightly plunge toward cold that would make them grateful for the cave's protection. Samuel built a small fire near the back of the cave, where the smoke would be dispersed by the water's spray and hidden from any eyes that might be watching the canyon. Ayana helped him gather dry wood from debris that had washed into the cave during past floods. Working together, they created a comfortable camp that felt surprisingly domestic despite their dangerous circumstances. As they sat beside the fire sharing another meal of jerky and hardtack, Samuel found himself studying Ayana's face in the flickering light. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was more than that. There was something about her spirit, her quiet courage in the face of terrible adversity, that touched something deep inside him he thought he'd buried along with his dreams of ever having a family. Samuel had been alone for so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to care about someone else's well-being more than his own. The ranching life was solitary by necessity, and his experiences in the cavalry had taught him to keep emotional distance from people who might not survive the next battle. But, sitting here beside this fire, listening to Ayana hum a soft Apache melody while she mended a tear in her dress, Samuel felt walls inside his heart beginning to crack. Ayana must have felt his gaze because she looked up and smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her entire face, chasing away the shadows of fear and exhaustion and revealing the vibrant young woman beneath the trauma. Samuel smiled back, and, for a moment, the cave felt like the safest place in the world. But safety was an illusion on the frontier, and Samuel knew their respite couldn't last. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult choices. Tonight, though, they were alive and together, and somehow that felt like enough. As the fire burned lower, Ayana curled up on the sandy floor using Samuel's spare blanket. She fell asleep quickly, the deep sleep of someone whose body desperately needed rest. Samuel took first watch, sitting near the cave entrance and listening to the night sounds of the desert while he planned their next moves. The woman sleeping behind him had already changed his life in ways he was just beginning to understand. Whatever happened next, Samuel knew there would be no going back to the simple existence he'd known before he found an Apache woman in a tattered dress standing in a canyon clearing like a vision of courage and desperation. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles and the small drama playing out in a hidden cave behind a desert waterfall. But, for Samuel Rodriguez, this night marked the beginning of a journey that would test everything he believed about honor, love, and the true meaning of home. Samuel woke before dawn to find Ayanna already awakened, sitting by the dying fire, her dark eyes reflecting the last orange embers. She had been watching him sleep, her expression thoughtful and, somehow sad. The night had passed peacefully, with no sounds of pursuit echoing through the canyon walls, but Samuel could sense tension in her posture that spoke of new worries. As the first pale light of morning filtered through their waterfall curtain, Ayanna began to speak in a mixture of Apache and broken English. Samuel was surprised to discover that she understood more English than she had initially revealed. Slowly, carefully, with frequent pauses to find the right words, she began to tell him her story. Her band had been living peacefully in the mountains, trying to stay away from both the cavalry and the growing settlements that sprawled across traditional Apache hunting grounds. They had been surviving on small game, wild plants, and occasional trading with Mexican merchants who asked no questions about their origins. It wasn't an easy life, but it was free, and freedom was worth any hardship to people who had seen what reservation life could do to the human spirit. 3 days ago, just before dawn, armed men had surrounded their small camp. Ayanna's voice grew steady and cold as she described what followed. The attackers wore a mixture of cavalry uniforms and civilian clothes, led by a sergeant who seemed to take particular pleasure in the fear he caused. They weren't looking for military victory or even revenge for past raids, they were taking prisoners for a purpose Ayanna had been too terrified to fully understand at the time. The men had separated the women and children from the warriors, killing any man who resisted and binding the rest. Ayanna's voice broke as she described watching her father and brothers die trying to protect their family. Her mother had been shot down while trying to reach Ayanna, dying in the dust with her daughter's name on her lips. Samuel's hands clenched into fists as he listened, anger burning hot in his chest. He'd seen the brutalities of frontier warfare from both sides, but the calculated cruelty Ayanna described went beyond anything that could be justified by military necessity or even revenge. This was something darker, more personal. Ayanna continued her story, explaining how the survivors had been forced to march eastward toward what the sergeant called the collection point. She overheard conversations between the soldiers and civilians that suggested they were gathering Apache prisoners for sale to mining operations that needed workers who wouldn't be missed if they died in the dangerous underground tunnels. The reality of what she was describing hit Samuel like a physical blow. Slavery had been abolished, but, in the remote territories where law enforcement was thin and moral oversight was non-existent, some men still found ways to profit from human misery. Apache prisoners could disappear into mines or remote ranches without anyone asking questions or demanding accountability. During her second night as a prisoner, Ayanna had managed to escape when one of the guards became careless after drinking too much whiskey. She had been running ever since, following game trails and hiding in rocky places that reminded her of childhood games that had now become deadly serious. She was trying to reach a sacred place her grandmother had told her about, where Apache spirits would protect her, when exhaustion and dehydration had finally stopped her in the clearing where Samuel found her. But that wasn't the end of her story. As Ayanna spoke, Samuel began to understand that her escape had been more than just running away from captors. She had overheard the sergeant making plans, talking about dates and locations for future raids. Her people weren't the only ones in danger, the operation was larger than a single attack, with multiple targets selected for their isolation and vulnerability. Ayanna pulled a small piece of paper from inside her dress, carefully unfolded and stained with her own blood. She had stolen it from the sergeant's jacket while the guards slept, recognizing its importance even though she couldn't read the English writing. Samuel took the paper with trembling hands and felt his blood turn to ice water as he read the contents. It was a list of Apache camps, Mexican settlements, and isolated homesteads throughout the territory, each marked with numbers that probably indicated population and potential resistance. Some entries had dates beside them, dates that were still in the future. At the bottom of the paper, in the sergeant's cramped handwriting, was a name that made Samuel's heart stop, Double or Ranch Rodriguez, minimal resistance expected. Samuel stared at the paper in disbelief. His ranch was on their list. The men who had destroyed Ayana's family were planning to attack his home, probably expecting to find a lone rancher who wouldn't be able to put up much of a fight. The dates suggested the attack would come within the next week. Ayana watched his face carefully as he read, understanding without words that he had found something significant. When Samuel showed her his name on the paper and pointed to himself, her eyes widened with new concern. She spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward the canyon entrance and making motions that clearly meant danger and urgency. Samuel's mind raced through the implications. If he returned to his ranch alone, he would be walking into a trap. The rogue soldiers obviously knew his routine, his weaknesses, probably even the layout of his property. But if he didn't return, his cattle would die of thirst and his life's work would be destroyed anyway. More troubling was the realization that this conspiracy was larger than a few corrupt soldiers looking for easy money. The detailed intelligence on the list suggested someone with access to official military information was involved. Someone in a position of authority was feeding information to the raiders, helping them select targets and plan attacks with minimal risk. Ayana seemed to read his thoughts because she spoke again, this time with bitter anger in her voice. She described the sergeant who had led the attack on her people, a man with distinctive scars on his face and a hatred for Apache that went beyond professional duty. She had heard other soldiers call him Sergeant Morrison, and she had seen the casual way he gave orders that suggested he was used to operating without oversight. The name meant nothing to Samuel, but the description troubled him. He had served with many good soldiers during his cavalry years, men who fought hard but maintained their humanity even in the face of Apache warfare's brutal realities. But he had also seen what the frontier could do to weak men, how the isolation and constant danger could twist someone's soul until they became something worse than the enemies they fought. As morning light grew stronger outside their shelter, Samuel knew they had to make some hard decisions. The safe thing would be to stay hidden in the cave until their pursuers gave up and moved on. But every hour they waited was another hour for the raiders to prepare their attack on his ranch and other innocent targets. Ayana seemed to understand his dilemma because she began speaking earnestly in her mixture of Apache and English, gesturing toward the cave entrance and, then, back toward Samuel. Gradually, he began to understand what she was proposing. She wanted to help him stop the raiders, to use her knowledge of their plans and his knowledge of the territory to prevent more massacres like the one that had destroyed her family. The idea was both compelling and terrifying. Samuel had tactical experience from his cavalry service, and he knew this country better than almost anyone. Ayana had current intelligence about the enemy's strength and plans. Together, they might be able to mount an effective defense or even launch a preemptive strike that would save innocent lives. But it would mean putting Ayana in terrible danger. If they were captured, her fate would be far worse than his. The raiders would see her as a valuable prisoner who had already escaped once, and they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. She would face torture, slavery, or death, and probably all three. Samuel tried to explain these risks to her, using gestures and simple words to communicate the danger she would face. Ayana listened patiently, then responded with quiet dignity that she understood the risks but had already lost everything that mattered to her. Her family was dead, her band scattered or enslaved, her way of life destroyed. Fighting back was the only way to honor the memory of those she had loved and, perhaps, prevent other families from suffering the same fate. Looking into her eyes, Samuel saw a determination that reminded him of the best soldiers he had served with, people who had found something worth dying for and were willing to pay any price to protect it. Ayana had been broken by tragedy, but she was choosing to forge herself into something stronger in the fires of her grief. Samuel made his decision. They would work together to stop the raiders, using every advantage they could muster and accepting the risks that came with choosing action over safety. It wasn't the smart choice or the safe choice, but it was the right choice, and sometimes that was the only consideration that mattered. As they began planning their strategy, Samuel found himself looking at Ayana with new respect. She wasn't just a victim who needed rescuing, she was a warrior choosing to fight back against impossible odds. Her courage humbled him and made him remember what it felt like to believe in something larger than his own survival. The morning sun climbed higher outside their waterfall shelter, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and red that matched the fire burning in Samuel's heart. He had found more than a woman in need of rescue, he had found a partner in a fight that would test everything he claimed to believe about justice and honor. The raiders thought they were hunting scattered prey, but they were about to discover that some of their victims had teeth and weren't afraid to use them. Samuel Rodriguez and Ayanna were about to teach Sergeant Morrison and his men that the desert held surprises for those who underestimated the courage of the people who called it home. The war was far from over, and the next battle was about to begin. Samuel and Ayanna spent the rest of the morning planning their strategy, using a combination of words, gestures, and drawings scratched in the sandy cave floor. The stolen intelligence paper provided crucial information about timing and targets, but they needed to understand the raiders' full capabilities before they could develop an effective counterstrike. According to Ayanna's observations during her captivity, Sergeant Morrison commanded at least 20 men divided into smaller groups that could operate independently or combine for larger operations. Most were deserters from various cavalry units, men who had chosen profit over duty and found that their military training made them valuable to criminal enterprises operating in the lawless spaces between official jurisdictions. The raiders had established a base camp somewhere in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, a temporary stronghold where they kept prisoners before selling them and stored supplies between raids. Ayanna had been blindfolded during most of her time there, but she remembered enough details about the journey to help Samuel narrow down possible locations. More importantly, she had observed their operational patterns. Morrison preferred to strike just before dawn, when his targets would be sleepy and disoriented. He used the same basic tactics for each raid: surround the target, eliminate resistance quickly, and secure valuable prisoners before anyone could escape or send for help. The approach was effective against isolated families and small groups, but it had predictable weaknesses that could be exploited by someone who knew what to expect. Samuel studied his mental map of the territory, considering defensive positions and potential ambush sites near his ranch. The doubler sat in a natural basin surrounded by low hills and rocky outcroppings that could provide excellent cover for defenders who knew the ground. If they could lure the raiders into attacking a prepared position instead of catching a sleeping rancher by surprise, the tactical advantage would shift dramatically. But first, they needed to warn other potential targets and gather intelligence about Morrison's current location. Samuel knew several neighbors who might be willing to help if they understood the scope of the threat they faced. The problem was reaching them without alerting the raiders that their plans had been discovered. Ayanna had an idea that both intrigued and worried Samuel. She proposed splitting up temporarily, with her making contact with any surviving members of her band who might have escaped Morrison's initial attack. Apache survivors would have scattered into the mountains using techniques perfected over generations of warfare, and they would be watching for signs of their missing people. If Ayanna could locate even a few warriors, they could provide intelligence about the raiders' base camp and perhaps even launch a coordinated attack that would distract Morrison from his planned assault on the ranch. But finding scattered Apache refugees would require Ayanna to travel alone through dangerous territory, potentially exposing herself to recapture or worse. Samuel's protective instincts rebelled against the idea of letting her take such risks, but he had to admit it was probably their best chance of gathering the intelligence they needed. Ayanna knew the Apache way of moving unseen through hostile country, and she could communicate with any survivors in ways that wouldn't alert enemy scouts. They spent hours refining the plan, accounting for timing, communication methods, and fallback options if things went wrong. Samuel would return to his ranch and begin preparing defenses while spreading warnings to neighboring homesteads and settlements. Ayanna would have 3 days to locate Apache survivors and gather intelligence about the raiders' base camp before returning to a predetermined meeting point near the ranch. If either of them failed to show up at the rendezvous, the other would assume the worst and proceed with a fallback plan designed to maximize damage to the raiders while minimizing civilian casualties. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best strategy they could devise with the resources and information available. As afternoon shadows lengthened outside their waterfall shelter, Samuel and Ayanna prepared for the separation that both knew might be permanent. If everything went wrong, they might never see each other again, and that possibility created an unexpected urgency in their final hours together. Samuel found himself studying Ayanna's face as if memorizing every detail, from the delicate curve of her cheekbone to the determined set of her jaw when she talked about fighting back against Morrison's forces. Somewhere between rescuing her and planning their counterattack, his feelings had shifted from protective concern to something much deeper and more complicated. Ayana seemed to sense the change in his attention because she looked up from her preparations and met his gaze directly. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the small fire, both recognizing the emotional current that had developed between them despite the desperate circumstances. Samuel had never expected to feel this way about an Apache woman. His cavalry service had taught him to see her people as enemies, obstacles to progress and civilization. But knowing Ayana as an individual had shattered those preconceptions, revealing the basic humanity that connected all people regardless of their cultural differences. When Ayana spoke, her voice was soft and hesitant, as if she was unsure about expressing feelings that crossed cultural boundaries as well as the immediate dangers they faced. She told him in her careful mixture of languages that meeting him had given her hope at a time when she thought all hope was lost. Finding someone willing to risk everything to help strangers had restored her faith that good people still existed in a world that seemed increasingly dominated by cruelty. Samuel reached across the fire and took her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of a life spent working with traditional Apache crafts and survival skills. Her fingers were small but strong, shaped by activities he could barely imagine but undeniably real and precious to him now. He tried to find words to express what she had come to mean to him, but language failed him. Instead, he simply held her hand and let his eyes convey emotions that transcended cultural barriers and spoke to the universal human need for connection in the face of overwhelming challenges. As darkness fell outside their shelter, they shared what might be their last meal together. Ayana had gathered wild plants during one of her scouting trips outside the cave, adding flavors to their simple provisions that reminded Samuel of how much he still didn't know about her world and her people. When it came time to sleep, they lay on opposite sides of the dying fire, but Samuel was acutely aware of her presence just a few feet away. Every sound she made, every shift in her breathing, registered in his consciousness with startling clarity. He found himself listening to her soft humming of Apache melodies and wondering if he would ever hear those songs again. Morning came too soon, bringing with it the necessity of separation and the terrible risks that lay ahead for both of them. Samuel saddled Thunder while Ayana gathered her few possessions and prepared for a journey that would test every survival skill her people had taught her. Before they parted, Samuel gave her his backup pistol, a small revolver that she could conceal beneath her clothing. Ayana accepted the weapon gravely, checking its action with the competence of someone who understood firearms despite her traditional upbringing. In return, she gave him a small carved piece of turquoise that had belonged to her grandmother, explaining that it carried protection for those far from home. Their goodbye was brief and formal, both of them understanding that emotional displays would only make the separation harder. Samuel watched Ayana disappear into the canyon maze like a shadow melting into rock, and then he mounted Thunder and began his own dangerous journey back toward a ranch that might already be under surveillance. The ride home gave Samuel time to think about the larger implications of what they were attempting. Morrison's operation represented more than just local crime, it was part of a pattern of exploitation and violence that would continue unless someone made a stand. Every successful raid emboldened the criminals and demonstrated to potential victims that resistance was futile. By choosing to fight back, Samuel and Ayana were taking responsibility for more than just their own survival. They were standing up for every family that might face Morrison's raiders in the future, every person who deserved to live without fear of being hunted like animals by men who had abandoned all pretense of honor. As the familiar landmarks of his ranch came into view, Samuel felt a strange mixture of homecoming and farewell. Whatever happened in the next few days would change everything about his life in this place. He might die defending it, or he might survive to build something new from the ashes of his old existence. Either way, the man who rode away from a hidden cave behind a desert waterfall was not the same person who had gone looking for lost cattle 3 days ago. Ayana had changed him in ways that went far beyond strategy and tactics, opening his heart to possibilities he had never imagined and showing him what it meant to choose love over fear in a world that seemed determined to destroy both. The battle for the Doubler Ranch was about to begin, and Samuel Rodriguez was ready to discover what he was truly made of when everything he valued was at stake. Samuel reached his ranch just as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the familiar buildings in shades of gold and amber that made everything look precious and fragile. The Doubler spread out before him exactly as he had left it 3 days ago, but now he saw it through different eyes, not just as his home, but as a battlefield where good and evil would clash in the ancient struggle that defined life on the frontier. His first priority was reconnaissance. Samuel spent an hour carefully examining the approaches to his property, looking for signs that Morrison's men had already begun their surveillance. He found evidence that riders had passed through the area recently, but the tracks were too old and weathered to tell him anything definitive about timing or numbers. The ranch house sat on a slight rise overlooking the main valley, with clear fields of fire in 3 directions and rocky hills providing cover to the north. Samuel's tactical eye, sharpened by years of cavalry service, immediately began cataloging defensive advantages and weaknesses. The barn and outbuildings could provide cover for attackers, but they could also be turned into defensive positions if properly prepared. Samuel spent the evening moving through his property like a ghost, setting up defensive preparations that would be invisible to casual observation but could turn the tide of battle when the time came. He positioned spare rifles and ammunition caches at strategic points, prepared fallback positions that could be defended by a single man, and created obstacles that would channel attackers into predetermined killing zones. The hardest part was the waiting. As the hours passed without any sign of Ayanna's return, Samuel found himself alternating between confidence in their plan and growing anxiety about what might have happened to her. Apache women were among the most skilled wilderness survivors in the world, but the country was full of dangers that could overwhelm even the most experienced traveler. On the morning of the second day, Samuel's nearest neighbor, Maria Santos, arrived with news that chilled his blood. Her small homestead had been attacked just before dawn, but she had escaped because she had been outside tending to a sick cow when the raiders struck. From her hiding place in the brush, she had watched uniformed men systematically loot her house and burn what they couldn't carry. Maria described the leader as a scarred man with sergeant's stripes who seemed to take particular pleasure in the destruction. When one of his men had questioned the value of attacking such a small target, the sergeant had responded that they needed to send a message about the consequences of resisting their operations. No one would be safe until the entire territory understood that cooperation was the only option for survival. Samuel felt ice form in his stomach as he realized Morrison was accelerating his timetable, probably in response to losing Ayanna and having his plans discovered. The attacks were no longer just about profit, they had become personal for a man who couldn't tolerate having his authority challenged by escaped prisoners and interfering ranchers. That evening, as Samuel maintained his vigil from a concealed position overlooking the ranch house, he heard the soft call of a desert owl that didn't quite sound natural. His heart leaped as he recognized the signal Ayanna had taught him, and he responded with the appropriate countersign. Minutes later, she materialized from the darkness like a spirit returning from the land of the dead. Ayanna brought news that was both encouraging and terrifying. She had found 6 surviving warriors from her band, men who had escaped Morrison's initial attack and been planning their own revenge. They had confirmed the location of the raiders' base camp and were willing to coordinate an attack that would draw Morrison's forces away from the ranch at the crucial moment. But the intelligence Ayanna had gathered also revealed the true scope of Morrison's operation. He commanded over 30 men now, having recruited additional deserters and outlaws attracted by the success of his raids. They had been systematically attacking isolated targets throughout the territory, selling Apache prisoners to mining operations and keeping the most valuable captives for larger slave auctions in Mexico. The attack on the Double R was planned for the following dawn, with Morrison bringing his full force to ensure that Samuel's defiance didn't inspire other potential resistors. The sergeant had apparently taken Samuel's interference personally, viewing it as a challenge to his authority that demanded overwhelming response. Ayanna had also learned something that made Samuel's blood boil with rage. Among Morrison's prisoners were children, some as young as 8 or 9 years old, being held at the base camp until they could be sold to buyers who valued workers too young and weak to effectively resist their captors. The casual cruelty of trafficking in children revealed a level of evil that transcended ordinary criminal greed. As they finalized their plans in the pre-dawn darkness, Samuel found himself looking at Ayanna with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. She had risked everything to gather the intelligence they needed, and now she was preparing to risk her life again in a battle that would determine whether Morrison's reign of terror continued or ended in the desert dust of New Mexico territory. The plan they developed was desperate but elegant. The Apache warriors would attack Morrison's base camp at first light, forcing him to either abandon his assault on the ranch or split his forces. Samuel and Ayanna would use the confusion to mount their own defense from prepared positions that turned the ranch's familiar geography into a series of deadly traps. If everything worked perfectly, Morrison would find himself fighting a two-front war against enemies who knew the terrain and had nothing left to lose. If anything went wrong, Samuel and Ayanna would die together defending something larger than themselves, the principle that good people had an obligation to stand up to evil regardless of the odds. As the eastern sky began to show the first hint of dawn, Samuel took Ayanna's hand in his own and spoke the words he had been unable to voice during their separation. He told her that finding her had changed his understanding of what it meant to be alive, that her courage had awakened feelings he thought he had buried forever with his dreams of family and belonging. Ayanna responded by placing her hand over his heart and speaking in Apache words that she translated as a promise that whatever happened in the coming battle, their spirits would find each other in the next world if they couldn't remain together in this one. It was both a declaration of love and an acceptance of mortality that Samuel found more beautiful than any poetry he had ever heard. The attack began exactly as Morrison's intelligence had predicted, with riders surrounding the ranch house in the gray light of dawn. But, instead of finding a sleeping rancher caught off guard, they encountered carefully prepared defenses and enemies who had turned Samuel's intimate knowledge of the property into a deadly advantage. Samuel's first shot dropped Morrison's point man from his saddle before the raiders even realized they had ridden into a trap. Ayanna, positioned in the barn loft with perfect fields of fire across the main approach, began picking off targets with the precision of someone fighting for the memory of her murdered family. Morrison's men found themselves channeled into killing zones where every piece of cover concealed another rifle and every shadow might hold death. The systematic destruction of isolated families had not prepared them for facing opponents who fought back with tactical sophistication and desperate courage. The battle raged for over an hour, with Morrison's superior numbers gradually whittled down by the defenders' advantages in position and motivation. When word arrived that the Apache war party had successfully attacked the base camp and freed the prisoners, several of Morrison's men broke and ran rather than continue a fight that had already cost them too much blood. The final confrontation came when Morrison himself, recognizing that his operation was doomed, charged the ranch house in a fury of personal hatred for the man who had destroyed his profitable enterprise. Samuel met him in single combat among the ruins of what had once been a peaceful homestead, two men representing completely different visions of what life on the frontier could become. When it ended, Morrison lay dead in the dust he had watered with so much innocent blood, and Samuel stood wounded but alive beside the woman who had taught him that love was stronger than fear and that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. The raiders who survived scattered to the winds, their organization shattered and their leader dead. The prisoners at the base camp were freed to return to their families or begin new lives far from the terror that had defined their recent existence. Most importantly, the territory learned that evil could be defeated when good people chose courage over comfort. Samuel and Ayanna spent their recovery time planning a future that honored both their separate cultures and the love that had grown between them. They would rebuild the Double R as a place where Apache and Mexican and Anglo families could find safety and community, proving that the frontier didn't have to be a place of endless conflict. In the end, the Apache woman in the tattered dress had saved more than just her own life by standing in that canyon clearing where a rancher found her. She had saved the soul of a man who had forgotten how to hope and sparked a change that would echo through the territory for generations to come. The desert winds still carried secrets across the vast spaces of New Mexico, but now some of those secrets spoke of love conquering hatred and courage triumphing over cruelty. In a land where survival often seemed to require hardness of heart, Samuel Rodriguez and Ayanna had proven that the greatest strength came from keeping one's heart open to the possibilities that love could create even in the most unlikely circumstances. Their story became legend in the territory, inspiring other isolated families to band together for mutual protection and showing that the frontier's future belonged to those who chose cooperation over conflict. The Double R Ranch grew into a symbol of what the West could become when people of different backgrounds united around shared values of justice, compassion, and hope. And, sometimes, on quiet desert evenings when the wind whispered through the sagebrush, travelers passing by the ranch could hear the sound of Apache melodies being sung in harmony with Mexican ballads and American hymns, proving that the human heart recognizes no boundaries when it comes to the universal languages of love and home.